Every old race car has history woven into every piece of it, and this one has come full circle. This is Larry Nelson's 55 Chevy Utility Sedan, which was a big contender in Superstock T in 1972, and after more than 40 years separated from this car, Larry got his hands on this thing again and completely rebuilt it just like it was in the 70s with just a few modern touches to make this thing even better than before. And the good news is he's still rocking that 265 base small block engine. It's got a manual transmission in it and it's got 614 gears out back. This thing has a cool combination of parts in it and it's got a bunch of great history. Let's get into it. It's a 1955 Chevy 150 two-door utility sedan. This was the lightest car that you could possibly get from Chevrolet in 1955. That's what Larry Nelson started with, so he and a friend, Dwayne Brock, put their heads together on this car. In 1970, this car was pulled from a junkyard, and they pieced together an engine and a transmission, and they're building this thing by the book. They're building it by NHRA regulations to fit within that superstock category. So as this car came together, Larry was still serving in the Army, so Dwayne actually drove this car toward the end of the 1971 season. With the NHRA Summer Nationals in Englishtown being a premier event for Larry's region, he put a lot of effort into getting the car ready for the big race. But before the Summer Nationals, this car really hit its stride. The two loaded the car up and went to Killcare on a Saturday where he beat Bob Glidden twice in a Superstock race. Then they loaded up and went to Bowling Green, Kentucky the next day to race at another Superstock race where they went through a big field of cars and ended up taking home the win. But before they could go home with the winnings, they had to tear the engine down so the officials could make sure this thing was legal. When it was all said and done, they took home $800 for that Superstock win in Bowling Green, and then just a few days later rolled into Englishtown for the Summer Nationals. Larry was on a warpath with this car, and his great performance continued into the Summer Nationals, where he went on to win Superstock T. So the way this would work out is he would compete for his class earlier in the event, and then on Sunday he would race against all the other class winners for a final eliminator. So he's having to race the big dogs here. He's not just racing the lower class cars, he's having to race them all. And he put out some big names on his way to winning this event. Not only did he win the event, he set a national record. So for this race, they were running off of a 1340 national record. That was kind of the basis for everything that they were doing in this particular class. So during the Summer Nationals, Larry ran a 1337, a 1410, a 1337, a 1342, another 1337, and then finally ended up running a 1320 in the final round to take the overall win and the Wally for the 1972 Superstock Eliminator at the Summer Nationals. I always love these old newspaper articles, and this is a good one here. Winner at Summer Nationals. And driver Larry Nelson of West Lafayette took the Superstock Eliminator title at the Summer Nationals in Englishtown, New Jersey recently. The 55 Chevy with a 265 cubic inch engine running in Superstock T class not only won the title, but lowered the class record from 13.38 seconds to 13.20. The win was worth between $5,500 and $6,500 to Brock and Nelson, partners for 2 years. And we're talking about just like a week span of racing, and this guy's got thousands of dollars in the bank account. And I mean, who wouldn't want to go professional drag racing after a week like that? Larry continued to have a great season in 1972. He ended up being runner-up at the NHRA World Finals, and then he won the National Dragster Open at National Trail Raceway, and he was relentless with this car. With great success in the 1972 season, Larry and Dwayne actually moved their drivetrain into a 55 Chevrolet station wagon. Now this moved them into a slightly different class, but it kept them in the lower ranks of the Superstock division. So the 55 two-door sedan actually went to brothers Joe and Paul Smith from New Hampshire. The Smith brothers ran this car occasionally in the 1970s, but it was never at the level that Larry and Dwayne had it. And the car continued to live on for many years while Larry went on to build other race cars. And over the years, Larry stayed in contact with Joe Smith to kind of keep tabs on his old 55 Chevy. Larry asked Joe on a few occasions if he'd sell the car back, but he never had any luck with it, and he just kind of moved on. He moved on with racing, and he moved on with his career. But then Larry happened to see his car in a classifieds listing on a drag racing forum, and he was shocked because he had been talking to Joe for all these years about potentially buying the car back, and now suddenly this car was for sale. So the reality there is that Joe had had a heart attack and was having some other health issues, and his brother Paul wasn't aware of the agreement that Larry and Joe had come up with. There was a lot of interest in the car right off the bat, and several people were in line to buy this thing, and it ended up being NHRA stock racer Lynn Smith who got the call to get this car. Well, he knew that Larry wanted the car back and ended up making a deal with him, and it was all good. Larry was happy with the deal, Lynn was happy to arrange it, and this iconic super stock car came back to Ohio after all these years. Obviously, it was a little rougher than when it left Larry's ownership, but it was still a pretty solid car, and Larry had some ideas about what he was going to do to put this car back to the way it was in 1972. Larry had years to think about what he might do to this car if he got his hands on it again. So when he brought this thing back to Ohio, he already had a plan together, and he wanted to put this thing back to its winning ways from 1972, and then make a few little changes, but still be NHRA compliant. Starting with the chassis and suspension, Larry actually replaced the frame underneath his old 55 because it had some previous modifications that moved the leaf springs inboard back when this car was running in Superstock in the 70s. So he wanted to have the leaf springs in the proper position and have a better frame altogether. So he put a different frame under this car, and he upgraded the front suspension with some Moroso trick springs and Calvert shocks. And then out back it's got Calvert mono leaf springs, it's got Calvert shocks and Caltrack bars. All of that is attached to a Chevy 12-bolt rear end, which is narrowed to 55 inches wide. And this rear end has a strange spool, strange axles, and 6 14 gears. Larry upgraded to strange disc brakes on the front and rear of the car, and then he put the old style tire and wheel combo back on this thing. He put skinny Kragers on the front with Moroso drag tires, 28 inches tall on those front runners. Then on the back he's got some black wheels with some 9-inch Hoosier slicks that fit right up under the quarter panels. This is a full weight, heavy street car basically with a small engine. So it's 265 cubic inches, but these classes were not separated by cubic inches, they were separated by a horsepower rating. So in the case of this 55 Chevy, it was running off of a superstock factor that looked at the original shipping weight of the car and the original horsepower rating of this particular combination. So this engine being a single 4-barrel 265, this was rated at 180 horsepower. So NHRA put together that factor and put together similarly prepared cars in that same class. So Superstock T could have had several different types of cars, but these tri-fives were really popular in the late 60s and early 70s for these lower level stock eliminator classes. So these engines, even though they were rated by the factory at 180 horsepower, there was a lot of tricks you could do to squeeze more horsepower and still stay within the NHRA rules. And that's what Larry took into consideration when he built this combination. So you can overbore the cylinders by 80 thousandths, you can increase the stroke of the crankshaft by 15 thousandths of an inch. So instead of the original bore and stroke on a stock 265, which is 3.75 inches on the bore and 3 inches on the stroke, he increased the bore to 3.80 inches and he increased the stroke to 3.013 inches, within 2 thousandths of that rule that the NHRA put into place. Up top is a set of power pack cylinder heads. These are GM 520 castings. The heads have Manley 1.72 and 1.5 inch valves, Harlan Sharp 1.5 to 1 rocker arms, and then for the camshaft you're limited to the exact valve lift that the engine came with from the factory. So Comp Cams and some other cam companies make stock eliminator style camshafts, and these things have bigger duration, they have bigger specs, but they still have that original valve lift. So that's what he's got in here, and you can convert it from hydraulic lifter to a solid lifter, which is what a lot of the guys do. And then up top, it's actually got a stock 55 Chevy 265 4-barrel intake manifold and a stock 55 Chevy second design carburetor. Now there are updates you can do to these engines. Even though you want some of those pieces to be factory original, you can upgrade the fuel system with electric fuel pump, you can upgrade the ignition with modern pieces, and that's exactly what Larry did. It's got an Aeromotive fuel pump and regulator, it's got just a 5-gallon fuel cell from JEGS, of course, and it's got an MSD distributor, MSD Digital 6 Plus box, and an MSD coil. So this thing's got a combination of those really cool old school pieces and some modern stuff too to make it all work together. And then the headers are old school stall headers, 1 5/8 inch primaries. Of course, it doesn't have mufflers. And then he put an aluminum radiator in there to keep this thing cool. So Larry Nelson built this engine, but he had Fowler Engines do some machine work for him. And then Dave Fields helped him tune this thing. So they've been working on this car for the past year, just tweaking it, tuning it, getting it really dialed in. And modern car guys are conditioned to think that any small block Chevy is going to make 400 horsepower without even breaking a sweat. But this full race prepared stock legal small block is making 258 horsepower at 6,238 RPMs. Now that's specific. And these things are specific. They're scientific. They are just down and dirty in the details to squeeze every ounce of horsepower out of these things. And by the way, it's making 217 foot-pounds of torque, and it runs on Sunoco 112 octane fuel. So here's an interesting detail that actually changed from 1972 to now. So in 1972, if you were running in the Superstock T class and you were running this 55 Chevy, that means you were running a 3-speed manual transmission. Now today, you can run a 4-speed transmission, which that opens up a whole new world of options for drag racers, and Larry ended up putting a Jericho 4-speed in this thing, which is perfect. That's exactly what this car needs, and it will allow this car to actually run better and be more reliable than it was in 1972. So you'll see the outside of this car is very slick, very nicely restored body on this thing, and that's the work of Tom Sondels there in Ohio. He straightened this car up and put it back into Nantucket blue with a white roof, and then he even did the old school speckle paint on the roof to make this thing just like it was back in the day. And then you'll notice the old school lettering just like it was. But what was really cool is when I found this picture, it's got 13.20 written on the windshield. So that was his index he was running off of at that race. And when I saw this car run at the Tri-5 Nationals in Bowling Green, he was running this thing on the same 1320 index. I had the pleasure of hanging out with Larry and his good friend Dave at the Tri-5 Nationals in Bowling Green. And this was really the first big race for the car. He had tested a little bit, but the first big race for this car was in front of a big crowd and against a lot of other cars that are similarly prepared. And Larry marched through the field of cars and he ended up taking home the win in his very first big race with the car. So he was absolutely thrilled. He was excited to do more and make this thing even quicker and faster. But it was super cool to see him take home a victory at a track that he had raced at 52 years before in this exact same car. So really neat experience. I enjoyed spending some time with him. I enjoyed learning more about him and learning more about this car. They made a great combination even for just 1 year. And now they're back together and turning on win lights just like it's 1972 all over again.